America just robbed a country at gunpoint and called it a drug bust. On the 3rd of January 2026, the United States military launched a full-scale assault on the capital city of Venezuela and kidnapped its sitting president from his bedroom at 2 in the morning while fighter jets bombed air defense installations across 4 separate states. Within 30 minutes, Nicolás Maduro and his wife were aboard an American helicopter heading toward a warship in the Caribbean, and within 48 hours he was standing in a Manhattan federal courthouse in handcuffs, telling the judge he considered himself a prisoner of war who had been abducted from his sovereign territory by a foreign military. The White House told the world this operation was about drug trafficking and narco-terrorism. But anyone paying attention to the actual words coming out of President Trump's mouth knew that explanation was a convenient fiction. Standing at Mar-a-Lago just hours after the raid, Trump announced that American oil companies would be entering Venezuela to rebuild the broken infrastructure and start generating revenue from the country's energy resources. He did not mention democracy or human rights or the suffering of the Venezuelan people under authoritarian rule. He talked about oil because Venezuela is sitting on 303 billion barrels of proven crude reserves, which represents approximately $17 trillion worth of extractable wealth and constitutes the single largest oil deposit anywhere on Earth. More than 100 people died during that operation, including 32 Cuban military advisors who were defending the presidential compound, and 7 American service members came home with injuries sustained during the assault. International law scholars immediately condemned the action as one of the most flagrant violations of national sovereignty. Since the invasion of Iraq, and yet financial markets around the world barely registered a reaction because professional traders understood something that casual news viewers completely failed to grasp about what had actually just occurred. The wealthiest and most powerful nation in human history does not conduct military operations to seize foreign oil fields when its financial position is secure. Empires launch desperate resource grabs when they are running out of options and running out of time, and the United States in January 2026 is staring down a debt situation so catastrophic that former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen appeared at an economics conference just 5 days after the Venezuela raid and publicly admitted that the preconditions for total monetary system failure are clearly strengthening in America. The federal government currently owes $38.5 trillion, which increases by approximately $6 billion every single day, and the interest payments alone on that mountain of debt just crossed $1 trillion annually for the first time in the nation's history, which means America now spends more money paying interest to its creditors than it spends on the entire Department of Defense. At the same time, 142,000 millionaires are relocating out of traditional wealth centers this year in what researchers are calling the largest voluntary migration of private capital ever recorded. Guess wealthy people tend to see what is coming before everyone else, and they are moving their assets to safer ground while the exits remain open. Venezuela was never really about Maduro, and it was never really about cocaine trafficking through the Caribbean. Venezuela was about an empire trying to secure hard assets before a 2,000-year-old pattern of monetary collapse finishes, executing the same sequence of destruction that has brought down every single dominant economic power in recorded human history without one solitary exception. The 2,000-year kill switch, the Roman denarius, contained 94% silver in 64 AD, and merchants across 3 continents accepted it without hesitation. By 265 AD, that same coin had been debased to less than 5% silver, and prices had exploded 70 times over. Roman soldiers demanded payment in gold, because the official currency had become worthless, and within 2 centuries the Western Empire ceased to exist entirely. The Dutch guilder placed regional currencies as the dominant medium of international exchange throughout the 1600s, and Amsterdam became the financial capital of the world. The Dutch East India Company grew into the most valuable corporation in human history, and Dutch banks financed trade from Indonesia to Brazil. But colonial administration and naval operations cost more than trade revenues could sustain, and by the 1700s, the Republic was borrowing heavily against future income. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War in 1780 bankrupted the nation, and the guilder lost reserve currency status to the British pound within a single generation. The pound sterling dominated global finance for the next 200 years, while Britain accumulated an empire spanning a quarter of the Earth's landmass. World War I broke the system when Britain borrowed massively from the United States. to fund the war effort, and by 1944, the dollar had formally replaced the pound at the center of international monetary arrangements. Britain went from creditor nation to debtor nation in 30 years, and the pound lost over 90% of its purchasing power during the managed decline that followed. The dollar assumed reserve currency status at Bretton Woods in 1944, backed by gold at $35 per ounce, with America holding 2/3 of global gold reserves. By 1971, the costs of Vietnam and Cold War military commitments and expanding domestic programs had drained those reserves to the point where foreign governments were actively converting their dollars to metal. Nixon closed the gold window on August 15th of that year, and the dollar became pure paper backed by nothing except confidence in American institutions. Consumer prices have increased over 700% since that date. When money weighed something between 1880 and 1914, every major currency on earth was convertible to a fixed weight of gold, and governments could not create money without acquiring the metal to back it. Real income per capita in the United States increased over 60% in a single generation, while inflation across the entire 34-year span remained essentially zero. Budget deficits required either raising taxes or borrowing real savings from citizens who expected repayment in currency worth what they had lent. Investment capital moved toward productive enterprises rather than speculative hedges against debasement, because the money supply could only expand as fast as gold mining operations could pull metal from the ground. The system ended in August 1914 when European powers abandoned gold convertibility to finance World War I through money creation. Britain and France and Germany all discovered that industrial warfare costs more than any tax base can sustain, and they chose inflation over military defeat. The attempt to restore gold backing in the 1920s collapsed into the Great Depression when the accumulated distortions proved impossible to unwind. Bretton Woods in 1944 created a hybrid system where the dollar alone remained convertible to gold while other currencies pegged to the dollar. The arrangement worked until Cold War military spending and Great Society domestic programs produced deficits that drained gold reserves throughout the 1960s. France under de Gaulle began aggressively converting dollars to gold, and other nations followed. Nixon faced a choice between cutting government spending or abandoning gold entirely, and Nixon chose the same path every leader in history has chosen and moved forward. The dollar has lost 87% of its purchasing power since that date, and the decline is accelerating rather than stabilizing. The spending trap empires do not collapse because enemies breach their walls. Collapse because internal costs compound faster than internal revenues, and the deficit between the two becomes mathematically impossible to close. Rome maintained legions stationed from Britain to Mesopotamia and funded public grain distributions that fed a million urban residents who would riot without them. The Dutch financed a global merchant fleet and colonial administration stretching across 2 hemispheres while fighting land wars against larger European neighbors. Britain garrisoned troops across territories containing 400 million people and operated a naval force capable of projecting power into any ocean simultaneously. Each empire discovered that the expense of holding what they had conquered eventually exceeded the wealth those conquests generated. The United States currently funds military operations across multiple continents while simultaneously financing retirement benefits for 70 million Americans and healthcare coverage for over 150 million citizens through various federal programs. These domestic obligations consume the majority of federal revenue before any other function of government receives a dollar. The annual budget shortfall last year exceeded $2 trillion, and that entire gap was financed through borrowing. Because cutting benefits is politically impossible and raising taxes sufficiently would trigger economic contraction. Debt funded through borrowing generates interest obligations that require additional borrowing to service, which generates additional interest. Obligations in a self-reinforcing cycle that accelerates with each passing year. The Congressional Budget Office projects that annual deficits will continue expanding indefinitely under current law because mandatory spending formulas automatically increase faster than any realistic economic growth rate. There is no combination of policy adjustments within normal political boundaries that reverses this trajectory, because the structural commitments already exceed the structural capacity to fund them. Every empire that has reached this arithmetic dead end has responded identically. Unable to cut spending and unwilling to default explicitly, They have chosen to reduce the real value of their obligations by expanding the currency supply, till debts become payable in depreciated units. The desperate grab empires facing unsustainable debt loads eventually turn to direct seizure of physical resources. Because financial engineering stops working once creditors lose confidence in repayment, the justifications vary, but the underlying motivation remains constant across centuries of documented imperial behavior. Iraq in 2003 was presented as a security operation against weapons programs that subsequent investigations confirmed did not exist. American forces prioritized the petroleum ministry building over hospitals and museums during the initial assault on Baghdad. The country contains 145 billion barrels of proven reserves, and major American energy corporations received extraction contracts within months of the invasion. Libya in 2011 was framed as humanitarian intervention to protect civilians from government violence. Muammar Gaddafi had been publicly promoting a gold-backed continental currency that would have allowed African nations to conduct trade without converting through dollars. He controlled the largest petroleum deposits on the African continent, and his government fell within 8 months of NATO intervention beginning. Syria became a battlefield, partly because competing pipeline proposals would have routed natural gas either through territory aligned with Washington or through territory aligned with Moscow. The official rationale focused on chemical weapons and humanitarian concerns, while the strategic reality involved hydrocarbon transit routes worth billions in annual revenue to whichever alliance controlled them. Venezuela fits the pattern with precision. Sealed indictments against Maduro had existed for years without generating military action until American negotiators were actively discussing access to the largest oil deposits on Earth, and federal borrowing costs were spiking past sustainable thresholds. The timing was not coincidental. Resource acquisition through force does not resolve structural fiscal imbalances, because extracted wealth cannot flow fast enough to offset compounding debt obligations. Iraqi petroleum infrastructure required years of reconstruction before meaningful output resumed. Venezuelan heavy crude demands specialized processing equipment and massive capital investment before generating returns. These operations purchase months or years of additional runway, while the underlying mathematics continue deteriorating in the background. 4 major resource-oriented military operations in 23 years suggests a pattern accelerating rather than stabilizing. 6 to 142,000 lifeboats wealthy people see collapse coming before anyone else, because they have accountants and advisors and access to information that ordinary citizens never encounter. When millionaires start moving their assets across borders in record numbers, that movement tells you something about where the smart money believes the world is heading. 142,000 individuals with liquid assets exceeding $1 million relocated internationally in 2025, which represents the largest voluntary migration of private wealth ever documented. Projections for 2026 put the number at 165,000, and the acceleration shows no sign of slowing. These are not refugees fleeing war zones or political persecution. These are sophisticated financial actors, repositioning their holdings based on calculated assessments of where value will be preserved and where it will be destroyed. The United Kingdom is bleeding millionaires faster than any nation on Earth, with 16,500 high-net-worth individuals establishing residency elsewhere this year alone. That exodus carries approximately £66 billion in liquid, investable assets out of British financial institutions and into foreign accounts. Britain was already struggling with post-Brexit economic dislocation, and the capital flight is compounding those problems into something approaching a structural crisis. China is losing millionaires at the second highest rate globally as business owners and investors seek protection from regulatory uncertainty and potential capital controls. India and South Korea and France and Brazil are all experiencing net outflows of wealthy residents. The pattern spans continents and political systems and affects both established powers and emerging economies. The destinations receiving this flood of relocating wealth share common characteristics. The United Arab Emirates expects nearly 10,000 millionaire arrivals this year, attracted by zero income tax and stable governance and geographic positioning between European and Asian markets. Singapore and Switzerland and Monaco continue absorbing wealthy migrants who prioritize asset protection over any other consideration. Capital does not flow toward collapsing systems. It flows away from them as quickly as available exits permit. Yellen's confession. 5 days after American helicopters lifted, Maduro out of Caracas, the former chair of the Federal Reserve, stood before an audience of economists in Philadelphia and said something that central bankers almost never say in public. Janet Yellen admitted that the preconditions for fiscal dominance are clearly strengthening in the United States. Fiscal dominance is the term economists use when government debt grows so large that it begins dictating monetary policy rather than the other way around. Under normal conditions, a central bank raises interest rates to combat inflation and lowers them to stimulate growth based on economic data and inflation targets. Under fiscal dominance, the central bank loses that freedom because raising rates would make government debt impossible to service. The math is straightforward. The federal government currently pays interest on $38 trillion in outstanding obligations. Every 1% increase in average borrowing costs adds $380 billion to annual interest expenses. A return to historically normal interest rates around 5 or 6% would push annual debt service costs beyond $2 trillion, which exceeds total income tax. Revenue collected from every American citizen and corporation combined. This creates a trap with no clean exit. The Federal Reserve cannot raise rates high enough to control inflation without triggering government insolvency. It cannot keep rates low enough to maintain debt sustainability without allowing inflation to accelerate. The institution designed to provide monetary stability becomes an instrument for managing an impossible fiscal situation. Yellen expressed hope that bipartisan cooperation might produce a sustainable fiscal path before the situation becomes unmanageable. She cited historical examples where political crises forced responsible budget agreements. But she also acknowledged that current projections show debt reaching 150% of gross domestic product within 3 decades under existing law and potentially much higher if economic growth disappoints or interest rates rise unexpectedly. The woman who ran the Federal Reserve and then the Treasury Department is publicly warning that America may be approaching a point where the normal tools of economic management stop functioning. The only 2 doors to every monetary system built on debt expansion eventually reaches a terminal point where only 2 outcomes remain possible. The government either defaults explicitly by refusing to honor its obligations, or it defaults implicitly by destroying the purchasing power of the currency those obligations are denominated in. There is no third door. Explicit default means bondholders receive less than they were promised. Governments announce they cannot pay scheduled interest or principal, and creditors absorb losses through restructuring negotiations. This happened to Argentina repeatedly, and to Greece in 2012, and to dozens of smaller nations throughout the 20th century. The immediate consequences include collapsed credit ratings and exclusion from international lending markets, and severe economic contraction as the financial system absorbs the shock. Implicit default through inflation achieves the same outcome through different mechanics. The government honors every obligation in nominal terms while the currency those payments arrive in purchases less than it did when the debt was issued. A bondholder who lent $100,000, expecting to receive that amount plus interest, gets exactly what was promised, but the groceries and housing, healthcare that money can buy have doubled or tripled or increased tenfold in price. The default is invisible on paper but devastating in practice. Weimar Germany chose the inflation path after World War I, and workers were paid twice daily because wages lost significant value between morning and afternoon. People carried wheelbarrows of currency to purchase basic goods, and restaurants stopped printing prices on menus because the numbers changed before customers finished eating. Zimbabwe chose the inflation path in the 2000s and printed $100 trillion notes that could not purchase a loaf of bread. Venezuela has been choosing the inflation path for a decade and removed 14 zeros from its currency through multiple redenominations. While citizens found more value in burning banknotes for heat than spending them, the United States has been quietly choosing the inflation path since 1971, but the pace of wealth destruction has remained slow enough that most Americans adapted without recognizing what was happening. That gradual erosion may continue for years, or it may accelerate suddenly depending on when creditor confidence breaks. The greatest heist you'll never see, monetary debasement, does not destroy wealth. It relocates wealth from one group of people to another through mechanisms that most citizens never recognize until the transfer is complete. The process works through timing. When governments expand currency supply, the new money enters circulation at specific points. Banks receive it first through lending facilities. Government contractors receive it through federal spending. Asset owners receive it as rising prices inflate the nominal value of their holdings. By the time wages and salaries adjust to reflect the expanded money supply, those first recipients have already converted their currency into tangible goods and property at pre-inflation prices. Workers who saved diligently for decades discover their retirement accounts purchase half what they expected. Pensioners on fixed incomes watch grocery bills consume larger portions of their monthly checks. Young families find housing prices have outpaced their earning capacity, regardless of how hard they work. Meanwhile, those who understood the mechanics accumulated real estate and equity, stakes and physical commodities that rose in nominal terms. Currency holders experience slow confiscation through purchasing power erosion. The families who maintained prosperity through historical monetary transitions held productive assets generating real output rather than paper claims denominated in failing currencies. Agricultural land produces food whether dollars hold value or not. Residential property provides shelter regardless of currency fluctuations. Essential businesses generate revenue in whatever medium of exchange society adopts after transition. The operation in Caracas did not create the fiscal pressures driving American policy. Those pressures accumulated over decades through choices made long before most current voters reached adulthood. What Venezuela demonstrated was that those pressures have intensified to the point where a military seizure of foreign resources appears preferable to confronting domestic spending obligations directly. The sequence that followed Rome and Amsterdam and London is executing again. The mathematics are identical, even if the technology and geography have changed. Some portion of the population will recognize this in time to adjust their positioning, and some portion will not.